Imagine this for a second. You're playing a video game and you're actually pretty good at it. Let's say a top 20 player in the world. However, you've got a problem. You've reached what you feel is your peak at the game, and it's getting pretty difficult to improve. This is natural. You're already nearing the peak of what's been humanly done, and finding room for improvement is going to be tough. You have a few options of what to do at this point. You could keep playing and try to push through your current skill ceiling. You could take a break for a little while and try to come back stronger with a fresh mindset. You could stop playing altogether, but you don't want to be a quitter. Or you could do something a bit nefarious. You could boot up a different version of the game that's just a bit slower. Nothing too crazy, maybe just 5/6 the speed. This is obviously going to take a bit to get used to, but once you do, you can clearly tell it's a helpful tool. You have more time to breathe after each input, you have more time to react to mistakes, and you'll be able to practice with more precision. Now, while this may be good as a practice tool, and you might be able to improve your ability a bit, any scores or times you set using this method obviously shouldn't count for the real leaderboards, right? Right? Well, in Mario Kart Double Dash, it's a bit different. This method, which is unfair at best, is not just allowed, it's built into the game, and now it's completely dominating Mario Kart Double Dash. Here's how. Alright, before I explain anything, we need to get a bit of a history lesson. This story goes as far back as the 1800s. Turns out there's this thing now called electricity, and it's pretty cool. Look at this, you can light up a room with it. How neat. That's not the only use of it either. There's this thing called a motor. If you send electricity to it, it'll spin. But you have to send the right amount of electricity or it won't work. Electricity travels in waves, and you need the right frequency or amount of cycles of a wave in a given second. People were using all sorts of frequencies for all sorts of things, but they found that for motors, somewhere between 50 and 60 cycles worked best. Now, in order to make things easier for people, governments will often standardize things to make them consistent and easy to understand for everyone. It's why all the plugs in your house or all the signs on the highway look the same. Governments started standardizing power frequencies. The United Kingdom standardized 50 cycles per second in 1904, but it didn't fully go into effect until decades later. Meanwhile, the United States, since we're better, didn't standardize at all and just kinda let everyone do whatever. Freedom, baby! But 60 cycles per second was becoming increasingly common in 1897, if not earlier, and no one was really making stuff in 50 cycles per second, so 60 cycles per second would end up being the de facto standard. Anyways, the 1900s are going to bring about even more technological advancements. In 1897, this guy, J.J. Thomson, is toying around with this thing called a cathode ray. It's what happens when you send electricity through a super tight vacuum tube. Call that a cathode ray tube for real. Using this, he was able to discover this thing called an electron, but that's irrelevant. He also found out he's able to deflect the cathode rays with an electric field. Another guy, Carl Ferdinand Braun, gets an idea from that. What if you can use this to display an image? This will be developed over the next few decades into something called a television. We're close to talking about Mario Kart, I promise. Now, when you're watching a TV, it looks like a smooth video, but it's really showing you a given number of images in a second. But depending on your part of the world, your TV might display a little differently. Since televisions are powered by electricity, they convert the electricity to images at a consistent rate, 1 frame for every 2 cycles. In the Americas and Japan, it'll be at 30 frames per second, but in Europe and Australia, since their electricity runs at 50 cycles per second, their TVs go at 25 frames per second. Anyways, fast forward a bit. It's the 1970s and we call cycles per second hertz now. There's also these things called video games. They kind of suck, but in the 80s and 90s, they're getting better. There's this one video game where you control this plumber dude named Mario, and it's a big hit. So big, in fact, that they're gonna make other games about him too. Holy shit, they're gonna have him race. Now, video game developers had an issue. They developed these games in 30 frames per second, but remember, not every TV runs at 30 frames per second. So what do you do then? Well, most game developers took the easy way out and just slowed the game down to 5/6 the speed so it would fit the 25 frames per second. This is how it worked for the first 2 installments in the Mario Kart series, Super Mario Kart and Mario Kart 64. But around the time these games came out, technological developments were being made so that televisions could display 60 Hz or 30 frames per second on a 50 Hz signal. Great, so now there should be no problem, right? Well, not every person in Europe or Australia is going to immediately buy a TV that supports 60 Hz. In fact, this difference really wasn't noticeable to many. So, at the turn of the millennium, game developers still had an issue. Some people in Europe and Australia, or the PAL region, still had 50 Hz only TVs, while others had 60 Hz TVs. So, when the next installment of the Mario Kart series was being released in 2003, the developers had to make their game as accessible as possible. Yes, nearly 800 words later, we are finally talking about Mario Kart Double Dash. But anyways, how did the developers solve this problem? Well, in the Americas and Japan, or the NTSC regions, the game just automatically booted in 60Hz because, well, that's the only TV setting they had. But in the PAL regions, when you loaded up the game, you'd get a menu telling you that the game supports 60Hz, but if you couldn't support 60Hz, you should select 50Hz. So only PAL people can play on 50Hz. But no problem, let's just boot up some 50Hz and see how the game feels. Well, alright, it definitely feels slower. It makes sense because it's a slower frame rate, but it doesn't seem like there's any major difference otherwise. Wait. Oh no. Oh no. Oh no, no. So the 50Hz mode slows everything down to 5/6 the speed, including the in-game timer. Now, this was actually quite convenient. Mario Kart Double Dash's console predecessor, Mario Kart 64, also had a PAL and NTSC frame difference, but the PAL version timer still matched real-time, so runners had to convert their times afterwards so they could be matched up on the same leaderboard. But for Double Dash, all the times were good to go, no conversion necessary. This made it quite easy for everyone to compare the times, which resulted in the creation of the combined leaderboard. It's exactly what it sounds like, a ranking that combines the 50Hz and 60Hz times for one universal leaderboard. This would emerge as the main leaderboard everyone used to track their ranking. But this is where the problem lies. 50Hz is effectively just the regular game in slow-mo. Theoretically, this should be a massive advantage. More time to make precise inputs, more time to react to mistakes, and less stress on your hands. This would, understandably, become debated quite a bit. A poll was ran shortly after the game's release asking if people thought 50Hz had an advantage. The three most voted on options were I don't know, yes but I don't care, and no. But now, it was time for players to put that to the test. Those in the Americas could only play 60Hz. Meanwhile, some people in Europe could only play 50Hz. But for the select group of Europeans who had the ability to play both, it was up to them to determine the future of Mario Kart Double Dash. They'd likely test out both and stick with whatever they found more comfortable. Well, here's what happened. From January 2004 to July 2016, or nearly a 4,600-day stretch, 15 people were the world champion of Mario Kart Double Dash, meaning they were ranked number 1 on the combined leaderboard. Of those champions, only 2 mainly used 60Hz, for a combined total of 125 days. The 2 players who didn't main 50Hz were Fernando Morto dos Santos, a Brazilian who didn't have access to 50Hz until after his championship stints, when he decided to invest in a setup and ended up becoming better than he ever was on 60Hz. The other, Marius Mollenhauer, was a German who was adamant on sticking with 60Hz despite its location. However, he was only world champion for a month, and his true legitimacy as a player has been debated. That's a topic for another day, but just take that as you will. Regardless, the over 15 years of competition had set a precedent. Advantageous or not, 50Hz was the way that most of the top players played the game and where all the good times were being set. Many top players did actually play 60Hz, but it mostly remained a side quest for them, and it was extremely rare that they would set a combined PR there. But in August of 2016, 60Hz would finally be back on the menu. Andrew Math was an American player who played 60Hz out of necessity. He had been bubbling under for a while, setting a few combined records here and there, but struggled to consistently keep up with the top 50Hzers. But many of them had stopped playing the game at this point. Andrew saw his opportunity, and he took it. On August 7th, 2016, he became the Mario Kart Double Dash World Champion. For the first time since 2005, the World Champion used 60Hz. And at this point, the switch flipped. 60Hz became the cool and hip game mode to play on. It was now, more or less, the meta. By May 2019, all 32 of the game's world records were set by 60Hz players. The 3 world champions since Andrew have all set their PRs exclusively on 60Hz, even Goomba, a player from the Netherlands who could easily get his hands on a 50Hz setup. But the world record charts tell a different story. 9 current records use 50Hz. While that's still under a third of the records, you have to consider that less than 5 years ago, 50Hz had no combined world records. It looked extinct and was widely considered the game mode for cheaters and has-beens. So, what changed? Well, not to be cliche, but there's been a bit of a revolution recently. 7 top-level players have one by one switched to 50Hz. How have they fared? Well, I'll let the results tell you. The first noteworthy player to make a switch was French player Mathilde. Mathilde was already an accomplished player. She set her first combined record on 60Hz in November of 2020, claiming the Rainbow Road course record with a time of 2:54.180. She had toyed around with 50Hz quite a bit, but never extensively used it. But in September 2021, she picked it up full time. She was already ranked 3, but would use 50Hz as a means to improve her times further. Her first big splash would come just a month later. In October, she would improve her own course record on Rainbow Road, while also snatching the lap record there. In August 2024, she would finally overcome the gap between her and the number 2 player, former world champion Optimistic Emo, to take second position on the leaderboards. She unfortunately hasn't submitted any time since, and she's since fallen to number 4 in the rankings, but in total, using 60Hz, she set 1 combined world record. Since switching to 50Hz, she set a total of 19 world records across 9 categories. 3 of these records still stand to this day, her Rainbow Road times and her Wario Coliseum lap. Aside from the stats themselves, her switch was the first time in the modern age where the discrepancy between 50 and 60Hz became a point of discussion. Just 4 days after Mathilde beat Goomba, the world champion at the time's lap record on Daisy Cruiser, Goomba started advocating for a 50Hz ban. Whether you think this was malicious or just a coincidence is for you to decide, but regardless, the community had been put on notice. Her success spoke for itself and showed that 50Hz was at the very least a viable, if not advantageous method of playing the game. Xander J was ranked just inside the top 20 in March of 2023, but was running into an issue. He had seemingly hit a wall and just couldn't improve efficiently anymore. That's when he would make a decision. He was going to start playing 50Hz. However, there'd be an issue with that idea. He was American. Now, if you aren't from Europe, 50Hz TVs and PAL game discs are not easy to come by. So if you're from the Americas, you had to spend the money to import a PAL disc and, if necessary, a TV that supports 50Hz. Or you could hack your Wii, install a ripped PAL copy of the game onto an SD card or USB drive, and load the game that way. However, Xander did go out of his way to actually purchase a disc and play the game the legal way. I won't specify how anyone else is playing 50Hz because it doesn't make any difference for the sake of this video, but I'll leave that up to your imagination. Anyway, Xander started playing on 50Hz, and the results became apparent almost immediately. He netted his first combined PR with it on April 5th on Baby Park. While playing, he noticed that he had much more time to react on the corners. Naturally, this logic could be applied to every course with turns, so all of them, and the improvements would start flowing in. Within a month of getting the 50Hz disc, he improved his rank from 19th to 17th. May would pass and he'd get up to 15th. In late May, he was at a time that would truly cement himself as a 50Hz player. I mentioned earlier that there's the combined leaderboards, where times from both Hertz are compared. Well, this logic applies to world records as well. There's the combined world records chart, which is, well, just the world records, a 60Hz records chart which only includes 60Hz times and was useful back when 60Hz wasn't the dominant mode, and a 50Hz record chart. The 50Hz chart had been sort of turned into a mix between a consolation prize and a museum from the decline of 50Hz, and that was certainly true for the Waluigi Stadium records. The 50Hz lap record had been set by French player Quidaire back in 2010, and at this point was over 13 years old. However, on May 22nd, Xander took it down by just 1 millisecond. Xander would continue playing 50Hz up until September of 2023, getting himself up to rank 13, a 6-spot improvement over his 60Hz self. He's played the game very sparingly since, but did pick up another 50Hz record in early 2024. Unfortunately, due to his recent inactivity and being passed by some newer players, including a couple who are going to be mentioned later in this video, he's fallen down the ranks a bit. But he's still ranked 17, which might just be a lot higher than he would be if he had stuck with 60Hz. 50Hz Boss obtained that nickname after going on one of the most unexpected world record runs in mid-2024. He had last played the game in March of 2023, but despite the inactivity, he had held on to his ranking of number 4. However, in July of 2024, he'd end up trying out 50Hz, and on the 21st, he'd post his first batch of time. 30.662 Mushroom City lap, 3rd place. 21.484 Peach Beach lap, world record. 117.916 Mushroom Bridge with a dropped mini turbo, world record. 25.417 Mushroom Bridge lap, world record. He'd submit 3 more times before the end of the month. 133.813 Mushroom City, 5th place. 25.570 Mario Circuit lap, world record. 30.634 Mushroom City lap, world record. Now, you may be noticing a trend with these tracks. All of these tracks he was setting times on, with the exception of Mario Circuit, have long straightaways that prioritize speedy, straight, and evenly spaced mini turbos. You might be able to see where this is going. While there's no way of knowing if he could or couldn't set these times on 60Hz, the fact that he was able to make such big leaps so quickly on the most skill-based tracks in the game is a sign of what 50Hz might just be able to do. The boss hasn't posted any more improvements since the 2 aforementioned batches of times. It's been over a year, and both of his Mushroom Bridge world records as well as his Mushroom City lap record are still standing. While he may have made a very short impact on the record boards and no real impact on the combined rankings, the impact of these times themselves would be undeniable. Joseph Emerald was a true veteran of Mario Kart Double Dash, joining the leaderboards all the way back in June of 2016. He had played exclusively on 60Hz, but that would all change in August of 2024. He had been playing the game pretty on and off, attempting brief comebacks in 2022 and 2023, but was never able to make a true triumphant return. However, after seeing some of the recently set 50Hz records, he decided he would give it a try. He didn't have huge expectations, and just tried it out on the tracks where his times weren't super good compared to the rest of his timesheet. However, he was able to get PRs on Wario Coliseum and Bowser's Castle within about a week, and decided he'd stick with it. Let's fast forward a bit. In February of 2025, Joseph had already improved his overall ranking from 24th to 20th in the 6th month since making the switch. However, he was now going to focus on his greatest strength. Yoshi Circuit had long been one of, if not his strongest tracks. His course and lap times both ranked 6th entering 2025, and he had even held the 60Hz record briefly all the way back in 2018. But his times were 7 years old at this point, and with his newfound powers on 50Hz, he saw a chance to not only improve his times, but compete for the combined record. Well, on February 24th, he did it. He set the Yoshi Circuit 3-lap world record. Not by much, only 9 milliseconds, but for the first time ever, he had held a non-shortcut world record. He'd returned to the track in May and would look for further improvements. One thing Emerald had noticed since starting on 50Hz was that it was far easier for him to de-rust after not playing for a bit. This was helpful because he usually couldn't play on weekdays, meaning he would have to take breaks quite consistently, but he could come back from the break easier. The same was true when he returned to the track in May, and it wouldn't be long before he got this, a 139.175. It was a big improvement, but now he had his sights set on 2 goals. The first goal was something he wasn't planning on doing originally, but now seemed much more realistic, taking down the lap record, which at the time was the oldest standing record in the game. His other goal to be the first person to get a 138 on Yoshi Circuit. Here's how he did. Today, his course time is a third of a second ahead of the fastest 60Hz time, and his lap is 50 milliseconds ahead. Yoshi Circuit is not the only course he's seen success on. He's also set the 50Hz course records on Luigi and Mario Circuit, the former of which took down a 9-year-old 50Hz record from Richard Carlson. Almost all of Joseph's current combined PRs have been set on 50Hz, and it's gotten him up to 18th in the combined rankings, a 6-spot improvement over his 60Hz self. Rick was a very high-ranking player in August of 2025, but he had run into a bit of a problem. He felt his skill had plateaued and was having trouble getting new improvements. So so he decided he would try out 50Hz. Well, it wouldn't take him long to start improving on 50Hz. Just 6 days after he played it for the first time, he was able to get a 9th place lap on Mushroom City. Then, just 3 days later, he got this, a 25.425 Mushroom Bridge flap, a 3rd place time, and just 8 milliseconds from 50Hz boss's aforementioned record. These times were a product of an advantage that I already touched on before, but Rick picked up on as well. He noticed that evenly spacing mini turbos was much easier to time, and this allowed him to net improvements on these straightaway heavy tracks. But these aren't the only tracks in the game, so he implemented 50Hz on more and more tracks just to see what could happen. And by mid-October, he had already improved his overall ranking by a spot. But it was at this point he would really hone in on 50Hz. First, on October 16th, he'd improved his Sherbetland lap from a 23.792 to 23.659, a massive 1/6 of a second cut that would propel him into the 7th place position in the category, as well as a 50Hz record. 2 days later, he would get another 50Hz record, this time with a 128.694 on Dry Dry Desert. 2 days passed, and it's yet another 50Hz record on Dry Dry Desert, as he scored a 27.549 lap. These 50Hz records both currently rank 9th on the leaderboards, and they joined the Sherbetland flap as top 10 times, but that still would not be the extent of the top 10 times he set that week. On the same day he set the Dry Dry Desert 50Hz course record, he improved on Peach Beach and was able to get an 8th place course time there. He'd set one more top 10 time the next week, a 30.775 10th place lap on Mushroom City. All these top 10 times had finally paid off. He was in the overall top 10. He set a few more times since, and as of today, he still ranks 10th on the combined leaderboards, a 3-spot jump from 13th achieved in just 2 months. Electro TTS was another player who consistently stayed around Rick's level. He originally tried 50Hz in May of 2025, but didn't stick with it for long. However, after seeing Rick's success, he decided to give it another go in late August. Well, on August 31st, he was playing his best track, Waluigi Stadium, when he got a lap of 30.400. Now, his 60Hz time was still faster, but this was a solid time that would end up being the 50Hz world record. Over the next few months, he'd continued playing multiple tracks, but his focus still remained on Waluigi Stadium. He played both the shortcut and non-shortcut categories of the track, repeatedly improving all 4 categories, including his 50Hz record on the non-shortcut lap, and setting the 50Hz course record on September 19th. At this point, both of his 50Hz non-shortcut PRs surpassed his 60Hz ones, and he wouldn't look back. On October 30th, he'd be playing his Golden Goose again. He had improved his 50Hz lap record all the way to 30.255 by this point, a strong run but still over 50 milliseconds behind the world record. Well, that afternoon, he'd set this. His first ever combined record. He'd improved his record one more time on November 23rd to a 30.150. He also holds both the course and lap record in the shortcut category and has set multiple best-known splits for both shortcut and non-shortcut. His success hasn't been limited to Waluigi Stadium though. He set top 10 times on Mushroom City and Dino Dino Jungle. He's not the most active player as he has been passed by one other player, but he also passed one player, the last 50Hz world champion Richard Carlson. So while he hasn't been the most active since making the switch, and he hasn't been able to make any crazy jumps on the combined leaderboards, his work is still notable, and most importantly, he's permanently etched himself into MKDD history. Optimistic Emo is probably the least notable of any of the players, but I wanted to throw him in here because his case is still pretty noteworthy. As briefly mentioned earlier, Emo was the former world champion of Mario Kart Double Dash, holding that title from December of 2020 to September of 2021, all while playing exclusively 60Hz. By the time he relinquished his title, he had stopped playing the game altogether. 2025 marked 4 years since he had last improved one of his times. But he saw Rick's improvements on 50Hz and thought this was an opportunity. Quote, "I started playing 50Hz directly because of Rick. He put a crack in the 50Hz dam, so I've decided to open the floodgates." Emo did play a bit of 50Hz in October of this year and was able to claim the 50Hz course records on Peach Beach and Dry Dry Desert, 2 categories he previously held combined world records in. While his 50Hz times were not quite on the level of his former world records, they were not too far off. While Emo has not been able to make a splash quite like the other 6 people here have, I still wanted to mention his story with 50Hz as I think it's quite remarkable. A former world champion who played exclusively on 60Hz is away from the game for over 4 years, then comes back, makes a major gameplay change, and is still able to play at or close to his peak performance. It's an impressive comeback tale that definitely doesn't deserve to go unnoticed. So, to recap, in the last 2 years, 7 top-level players have switched to playing on 50Hz. 6 of those 7 have seen noticeable success, in total improving their ranking by 11 spots. 4 people have been able to claim 38 combined non-shortcut world records in total, and all have held a 50Hz record at some point. So, where do we go from here? We're clearly getting past the point of anything possible on 50Hz is also possible on 60Hz. The last 50Hz world champion, Richard Carlson, now ranks 15th on the overall leaderboard. Players have gotten much better, and any advantage they can get their hands on is going to be more and more impactful. And yes, this is me saying that 50Hz is undeniably an advantage. If you haven't picked up on that, then I haven't done my job. Most people, including those who play 50Hz, find it easier to play and improve their times on. And if it really wasn't an advantage, why would so many people be clamoring to make the switch? So yes, 50Hz is an advantage, but what do we do about it? Here's my proposal. I actually don't think we should ban 50Hz. That's an overarching band-aid solution that completely obsoletes years worth of times and accomplishments, and completely screws over the people who did put time and possibly money into making the switch. Avid 50Hz haters will say this is karma for making the wrong choice. I say it's just being mean because we're mad people made what is ultimately a better decision for their playing career. Also, in the extremely rare, albeit possible case of someone not having a setup that supports 60Hz, it would completely bar them from playing the game. So here's what I would do. On the players page, there are 3 tabs on the side for the combined rankings, 60Hz rankings, and 50Hz rankings. I've moved the combined tab underneath the other 2 as it's becoming increasingly clear that there's no fair way to have the 2 game modes on the same leaderboard. I'd keep 60Hz up top to guide people towards the more popular, more accessible, and more politically correct choice. Additionally, in the weekly news, the recap of all the new times from the week, I'd put both the rank of the player on that Hertz and the player's combined rank. I think this is the most fair solution. It doesn't obsolete any history or disadvantage anyone, and still acknowledges the advantage one game mode has. But I'm curious as to what you guys think. This admittedly hasn't been seriously discussed much within the community, and I'm willing to hear opinions on this from people both inside and outside of the scene. It's not my decision to make, but agreement on something can get us closer to some sort of change being made. So again, if you have any opinions on this whatsoever, feel free to leave a comment below. I'd love to talk this out with some people. And hey, if you watched this far, you probably enjoyed this video, so thank you. I'd really appreciate if you could drop a like or subscribe if you haven't already. Any amount of support is appreciated. Thanks for watching.